Inside of 3 weeks away from the start of Ohio State spring camp, what could be better than that? 3 weeks? Wait, today's Thursday. That number is perfect. It's Three Things Thursday on the podcast daily. That's Jeremy Birmingham. I am Austin Ward. And Birmingham, admit it, you've got just a little FOMO that you're not at the NFL Combine, don't you?
No, I do have some, I don't know, kudos, I guess. Every week when we do this Thursday show, I'm more and more impressed that you find a way to incorporate three things into the open because not easy, but you find a way to do it every time. No, I will admit to saying that when we see, I wish we could talk to some of the guys a little bit. I do. I'm interested in what they're up to from a preparation standpoint for the NFL draft, but I certainly not missing it from a coverage standpoint. I would rather just be there and hang out and shoot the proverbial bull poop with people. But that's not always the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe earlier in the week we were too dismissive of, I don't know, some value for this event. If people are there, there's going to be news that comes out of it. I remember having conversations with, now former Buckeyes about some guys to watch going into spring camp and getting some value out of that. But as more and more people started covering the Combine, you got less and less opportunities to actually interact with those players in a way that we used to. Like, I remember walking back, behind the curtain to talk to Chase Young. That was 5 years ago. And they had, their schedules were not as compressed. And then as they stopped working out and doing the 40s and the bench press, and I just, for me personally, it felt like a less meaningful experience for us to actually provide something for the audience, but not insignificant to the Buckeyes who are still going there, beginning their interview process, meeting teams, talking to general managers, coaches on down the line. I hope that they all get what they want out of it, but Pro Day seems to carry a lot more weight for Ohio State specifically. But the fact that we're not there, I'm fine with it. I'm not as fine with the first thing, which is, how did Josh Fryer and G. Scott not get invited to Indianapolis?
It's perplexing. I guess I can understand G. Scott from, he is a guy that I'm not sure would be on most NFL draft boards at this point as a 6'3", 238-pound tight end who's only really played the position for 2 years. I understand it. I guess he's obviously an above-average pass catcher at the position and maybe one of the better in the country at that position, just as a pass catcher totally. But for Josh Fryer, you're talking about a guy who was a 3-year starter at Ohio State on the offensive line, can play both sides at tackle, can play inside, can play center. I guess I go back to like Andrew Norwell didn't get invited to the NFL Combine, and he became one of the highest paid guards in the history of the league. There's still going to be plenty of opportunity for Josh Fryer to get there, but I guess this competition and this Combine is about showing off athleticism or something like that. And maybe they don't think that he's that much of an athletic freak, but if my argument is they should watch him swing a golf club. He's got a smooth swing. It is weird. I'm sure that there's snubs from other teams, and Ohio State obviously has 15 guys there. So you look at it and you can't complain too loudly that maybe they're not being represented. But Josh Fryer, especially a kid from Indianapolis, I imagine that hurts a little bit for him, as everything he went through at Ohio State, to be able to have that opportunity in his home city, I think would be awesome for him. But I bet he's going to find a way to make teams regret that. And I'm sure he'll show out at the Ohio State Pro Day.
Yeah. I know how it works. And I know they didn't just say, well, we're going to cap Ohio State at 15. They are, as you said, incredibly well represented, almost record-setting fashion for them. Like, what's the harm in one more? And I also know how it works. Like, multiple teams have to request a player to show up to earn an invitation to the Combine. But you cannot convince me. And in fact, I would boldly predict that Josh Fryer is absolutely going to get drafted in April, because somebody with multiple years of starting experience at the Big Ten level, good starting experience, including some awards for it, even as much as he may have been scrutinized for his first full year starting at tackle 2 years ago. Believe that was the first team all Big Ten year by some folks in the voting block there. And the starter unquestionably at right tackle throughout the entire run to the national championship. You can't convince me that there's not one NFL team that is going to take him by the end of 7 rounds and however many picks they're up to, 270. Like, Josh Fryer is going to get drafted, and that will make it even more puzzling that he didn't get this cool experience, which for the players, I would say it is, even though it's taxing and long and the hours are bizarre and they They herd them around like cattle. Like, I think that's part of the journey. And players, Ohio State players that finish their careers in that way and are moving to the NFL expect to, be rewarded with that trip. And I do feel bad for him from that regard.
I mean, I go back to Norwell, who didn't get drafted, and it turned out okay for him. These are really high level athletes. There's a ton of them out there, but I think for a guy like G. Scott, maybe it's more a byproduct of like I said, the positional confusion, off the field stuff that had haunted him for the first couple of years of his career. You also, aside from multiple teams having to want you there, I think a lot of times these conversations of why teams don't want you there is because maybe they've had conversations with your former school or whatever. So I don't think that would be the case for G now, but I do think that it's just motivation. It's a chip on the shoulder, and a guy for Josh, like a guy like Josh, he's going to find a spot. I'm convinced of that. He's too versatile, too big, and too athletic to not have that opportunity. So hopefully he gets it. It does suck, like I said, that he's not there for just because he's from Indianapolis, and you would hope that you'd get that opportunity to do that at home, but it is what it is.
If you were in Indianapolis in that convention center press conference room, waiting for one of these 15 Buckeyes, which one do you think is you would have been most intrigued to talk to this week about what the last 5 weeks have been like for them?
I mean, you know me. I always go to the quarterback. I think that just the Will Howard experience, what he's the roller coaster ride that he's been on in the last year, the rocket ship that he's been on in the last month. Now people talking about him 4 months ago as a 5th round pick, maybe, and now people talking about him as a top 50 pick and almost a surefire second day guy. Like, I think that's interesting. I've seen comparisons to him to like Joe Flacco, which I'm not sure I buy exactly, but I think that
why?
Because of the size and just the way that they move. It's like Flacco coming out. Flacco coming out of Delaware was not like a statue. He was obviously everything's easy. Everyone moves younger, moves better when they're 22. But I've seen comparisons to that type of guy. Because we're guilty of it too. The natural comparisons we want to make are like to Ben Roethlisberger or Josh Allen or someone like that, just because he's huge. But I'm interested in what the NFL teams are saying to him now versus what they said to him or what he was hearing 4 months ago, because I think that he, more than anybody on the Ohio State roster during the playoff run, changed the perception about him in the NFL draft circles. So I'm interested to see if that's leading to some increased conversations or conversations with more teams. How much the Raiders now with Chip Kelly have like dialed in on him because they desperately need a quarterback to come in and take over that franchise. But there's definitely a lot of guys. I'm very interested to see what teams are saying to Travion Henderson, because his versatility and the things he showed this year were so different than what he did in the first couple of years of his career at Ohio State, and not just the staying healthy, but the physicality which he played with this year. Like I'm very interested. I've seen mock drafts now that have him in the first round, which would be a shock. I think number one, because running backs just don't get taken in the first round, but number two, because if a year ago people were thinking that he was going to be and also ran in the Ohio State offense when Quinshon Judkins came in.
Mm-hmm. I cannot get past that you read Will Howard comparisons to Joe Flacco. How can it be possible that a year ago, everyone in the world is saying, well, the comp here is Josh Allen? I'd say, well, that's too much. Like, you cannot, that's unfair to try and set him to that standard. The golden god of quarterbacking, the NFL MVP. And I can understand where that came from. In the first conversation we had with Will Howard, he said the person he tried to model his game after was Josh Allen. And that's because of the mobility. Like Joe Flacco, you may say he moved better coming out of college, but it was still like, look at the rocket arm of this guy and the accuracy. Like how did we go from inaccuracy, which was the knock of Josh Allen for people who never watched him at Wyoming, and mobility for Will Howard, to Joe Flacco after last year? I guess completing 73% of your passes can help, but that's just
not being able to
wild.
Not being able to run 10 yards without tripping over your own feet, I think played a factor in that. I think the real comparison there comes from just the way he picked up the Ohio State offense, the way he ran the offense, the way that, I don't know that in his time, in his 4 years at Kansas State, Will Howard had a chance to really show his football acumen. I think when we talked to Ryan Day on the 24 Ever series, like that's the thing he kept going back to was how smart Will Howard was. And I think that we saw a guy come in and not just take on the role of the leadership of the program at Ohio State and become the face of the program, but also a guy who owned the offense in a very short amount of time. And if you look back at Justin Fields and Dwayne Haskins and CJ Stroud and any other quarterback that's been through Ohio State, to see that he did that as quickly as he did, like that is remarkable, because that is not an easy offense for a quarterback to master. And Will Howard mastered it and did so with a higher completion percentage than any quarterback in Ohio State history. So, and it wasn't like he was just doing dink and dunk stuff. This wasn't the JT Barrett offense where you're having a bunch of jet sweeps and pop passes. Like he was putting the ball in really good spots. And I think when you combine all those things, and then you get a chance to meet him and look at how big he is and get a sense of Will's personality and his ability to lead people, I think that it's crazy to me, I guess, that it took this much stuff to happen for him to be considered a second round pick in the NFL. But I think he's going to be that. And I think that just getting feedback from him about how grateful he is for the year he had would be really important, because I know that he was talking about the NFL a year ago.
Yeah.
But if he did that, imagine how much different his life would have been, not being a national champ, maybe 4 or 5 round difference in the NFL draft. Like that's a huge difference.
Yeah, no. So the thing number 2 was going to be shifting gears to the current roster, and a thing about it that you are thinking maybe too much about, or more than you expected to. And you just talked about Will Howard, and you've already this week talked about the controversy at quarterback. So I don't want thing number 2 to be you're thinking too much about the quarterbacks. I'm ruling that one out. What other position group or player or coach are you thinking too much about right now?
I don't know. Are we all thinking too much about about the conversation about Ohio State going to more of a multiple front on defense? I think probably. I just don't. I'm looking at the defensive line and the depth and the experience, and I don't know how Ohio State can enter spring thinking firmly and fully that it's going to be a 4-down defensive front, because I just don't see the guys there. But I also, I don't know if that's something that Ohio State would be comfortable going away from when you had the number 1 defense in the country with the way it was aligned. And yeah, I mean, you're trying to replace some key parts, but I do wonder if it just makes sense to stick with what you had, as opposed to trying to completely implement a brand new system. Now, Matt Patricia's history is a guy that can be flexible and change things around from year to year based on personnel. But when you're already replacing 8 starters or 7 starters on defense, or however many it is, like, and then you change everything up, I do wonder if that's maybe being talked about too much. And maybe you just try to see if you have the pieces in place and the pieces on the roster to replace the guys that left with the situation that they're used to, as opposed to changing things. But I think about guys like Kenyatta Jackson and Caden Curry, and I think, man, I think Caden Curry would be better in a 3-4. Right? If you put him as an outside linebacker, or you drop CJ Hicks down to the defensive line and you let him line up, like I think that there's the personnel stacks up in a way for me personally that I see them as much more likely to be productive in a 3-4. But I also wonder if it's overblown, and we're not going to know, because I don't think they're going to play actual football this spring.
Yeah, no. I mean, but there are a lot of guys on this roster that still need those reps. I mean, Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson probably don't. Although the scary thing is for you is that I was also thinking a lot about Ohio State's defensive line, and it played into the dudes who are at the NFL Combine and just how difficult it's going to be to replace Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau. Let's set aside the defensive tackle conversation for now. I think the assumption that we have had, and I say it in a lot of different shows, have multiple times, like, these are seniors. They've waited their turn. We know how good Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson, we think we know how good they can be. But they still are going to have to go out and prove that. And the shoes that are left behind for them, the level that those 2 guys played at during the playoff run and in the second half of the year was pretty remarkable. And I don't know that that's going to be easy. That standard is the standard, and it's pretty darn high. And there's not a tremendous amount of depth. Like, there's not a Caden Curry or Kenyatta Jackson necessarily waiting behind those guys. So that, like, I'm starting to, it's not skepticism. I'm just thinking about defensive end more than I anticipated. And part of it is still as you mentioned, Matt Patricia coming in, and also, I guess a lingering uncertainty with Larry Johnson. I think going into the end of February, we haven't had any public confirmation from him or Ryan Day about, if he's returning. There's been private conversation that Ohio State is expecting him to, that he's been working throughout this month of February, that he was working on the recruiting trail at the end of January once the national championship was done.
And still he's calling kids. He's involved in all the conversations with defensive linemen.
It's like we think that's happening, and I have no problem if it does. I think he absolutely earned the right to make that decision, and if he wants to stick around for one more year, he should. That would be a sea change from what I had said in the previous few off seasons, but I reserve the right to evaluate new evidence and change my mind about that. And if I was wrong in the previous couple of years, I'll have to eat that, and I will. And I'm not going to pretend like I didn't say some of those things in the past, or that I don't still feel like they may have been true at that time. Aside from all that, I just think
things change, Mox.
They do, Mox. And look, I don't know what it's going to look like, because those veterans don't need to practice ton spring. And there's, as you said, probably not going to be a ton of hitting going involved in any of those 14 practices leading up to the spring showcase. But I think to just assume the way that I have, and I'm not trying to talk myself out of it, that everything is going to be okay because Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson are there and ready and waiting for their turn. Maybe that won't be the case. We'll see.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the recruiting in the last 4 years since the Jack and JT class in 2021, it has fallen off on the defensive line. It's not to say that Larry Johnson's not trying. It's not to say he's not brought in good players like Caden McDonald or Edric Houston, et cetera. But if we look, and I'm just reading a presumptive depth chart for 2025 right now, you have Caden Curry, Caden McDonald, Edric Houston, Kenyatta Jackson as your starters. Like, that's a pretty good group. And probably if we look back since 2015, we've never had a concern that Ohio State starters, even if they're replacing All-American type guys, we're not going to be able to do the job. Right. But there's never been an issue where you think, well, if this guy doesn't perform, then you don't have anybody behind him. And if you look at these guys that are the backups, you have Zion Grady, a true freshman. You have Tywan Malone, Jason Moore, Logan George, CJ Hicks potentially as a defensive end. Then you have Joshua Mickens, Eric Mensah, Will Smith, Dominic Kirks.
That's the stuff that's hitting home for me.
Yeah, good players, but to suggest that there's any certainty that those guys are ready to go, I think is probably folly, because we don't have any evidence to support that. Now, we know that they're really good players. They've been at Ohio State, most of those guys now, for 2 years. But it is a real question mark heading into the spring. And that's why, we talked about it a little bit with Bill on the Wednesday morning podcast daily. But I don't know. You look at the roster and you think, hey, they should be set, and then, no other changes. But I think you have to go out and look for a defensive end or a defensive tackle if you can convince someone one way or the other to that there's a huge opportunity at Ohio State. I love Caden Curry. No one's going to ever question that. I think Caden Curry is a remarkably good football player, but I don't know if he's ready to be an every down defensive end at Ohio State. And he is still 6'3" and 250 pounds, 265 maybe now, but I don't know if he's ready to be an every down guy. The energy he brings, that as hard as he plays, he might be better suited to be a third down guy or just a pass rush guy. I don't know. And so if you look at the rest of this roster, man, like you'd be hard pressed to convince me that it wasn't worth at least looking around for some other defensive ends, or you're going to need someone like Zion Grady, who I'm high on as an incoming freshman, or Epi Santinelli, the incoming freshman from St. John Bosco out in California, but he's not going to arrive on campus till May. So like, I don't know, man. It is, I think it's an interesting discussion, and one that is probably needs to happen in a more nuanced setting than this. But for Larry Johnson, for his entire career at Ohio State, like what we presume, if 25, we presume will be his final year, and until we're told differently, until he signs a new contract or whatever, then I think that's fair to assume. Like, it will probably be his most challenging as a defensive line coach at Ohio State. So I think it's a weird juxtaposition of like, hey, you've built all this stuff. You're a 2-time national champ. You're a legend. You've done all this great recruiting. And now your final season is going to be the one where people are like, what do you have? Like, it might be, if the Buckeyes are to compete for a national championship, it's probably going to be on the back of what would be Larry Johnson's most difficult coaching job yet.
Yeah.
And the
I,
home
I
McGunn's
don't,
okay with that.
yeah, no, I mean, I think that's the conversation that I'm having in my head that I didn't know I would have it to this level, like, because just year after year, even if the depth wasn't ideal, you'd be like, well, the starting group is going to be the best, one of the best in America, the best in the Big Ten. They're going to be productive, and I think that's probably a fair expectation to have of this group. But you look at the next wave, and that's where I'm like, okay, I'm a little bit skeptical there.
Especially in a 15 or 16 or 17 game season. Like
Absolutely,
we know you're going to have to test that depth.
yeah, and they had to do that a year ago. You saw JT playing through injuries, but they were in a blessed position where you had Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson with 3 years of experience and some high leverage snaps under their belts. That's just not going to be the case for this team. All right, that's a longer thing number 2 than I anticipated, and it's scary that we were thinking about the same thing. Thing number 3, we talked to Justin Fry earlier this week, and let's tease a little 24 ever. What was the most interesting thing that you heard from Justin Fry as we get folks ready for episode number 3 of this series?
I guess I wasn't anticipating the conversation about how worried he was heading into the Notre Dame game about another injury. Like the things, how Ohio State had to practice throughout the last half of the season in order to make sure guys are healthy, and like just the finger crossing to make sure you had guys ready. There's a ton of conversation on this episode about Carson Hinsman. I think that's well deserved. And ultimately, I mean, I don't think that there's anything so surprising there, but just knowing that coaches are people, sometimes I think we forget that, like how sometimes things just continue to go badly, and you just want to like bang your head against the wall and be like, why me? Why me? Why me? And I really appreciated Justin and him sitting down with us, because I think that he's always been very genuine. But I hope people will see a side of them as people that maybe they hadn't considered.
I wonder it's like we knew that there was something going on with Austin Sareveld as they continued that 3-man rotation with Luke Montgomery and Tegra Shabola as they tried to duct tape that group together to get through the playoff run. And I wonder if it would have like set off a wave of panic if Ohio State had talked a little bit more publicly about what he was going through as part of the explanation for Luke Montgomery going in. I think we assumed it was primarily tied to Tegra Shabola's dip in production in the second half of the year. Like, I wonder if that would have helped or hurt if we knew the level of injury that Ohio State was still dealing with someone who became really important multiple times throughout this year.
Yeah, and he also let us know that Tegra Shabola had a shoulder injury that he was dealing with through the playoff run as well. So it's fascinating, just because we talked a lot about Luke Montgomery in the spring and how we thought he was going to be ready to go. And Justin was pretty clear that Luke thought he was going to be ready to go multiple times, and then admitted, like, I thought I was there and then I mess up. I thought I was there and then I fall back. And so just the growth pattern of these linemen. And we've talked before about how the offensive line is a developmental position and how long it takes for guys to get ready. But if you look back in the last decade of Ohio State football, you look at guys like Wyatt Davis and when he was ready to go, or Demetrius Knox when he was ready to go. Like it's like it doesn't always happen when you think so. It doesn't always happen. Pat Elflein or one of these, when they just get thrown in and it's like, oh man, I don't know if I'm ready. The coalescence of confidence, but also like doubt, and how that comes together, and how sometimes these players just have no choice but to say, screw it, I have no time, I'm just going to go.
Yeah.
Is awesome. And I wish we could have got a little bit more into the weeds with him about like Josh Simmons and the why he wasn't around the team as much in the last half of the season after his injury. But I think maybe Josh was getting some bad advice from agents about stuff, and I feel like I would have liked. Justin's certainly not going to say anything negative in those situations, but I would like to know, like how the Ohio State players reacted versus how they reacted to Seth McLaughlin and his decision to stick around. I mean, I look back on the difference between Jackson Smith and Jigba being around the team throughout the entire 22 season versus Nick Bosa leaving in 2018, and how different it was. But yet when the team saw him, if you remember when we were in California at the Rose Bowl that year, like they were like, oh my God, Nick, like they loved him. They weren't mad at him or anything. But I do wonder sometimes how the players respond to that, because there's so much talk about brotherhood and tightness. And then when a guy just disappears, it sort of felt weird. But I guess that probably wasn't the time to ask that question.
Yeah. And, I think the brotherhood and the combination of the professionalization of college football and the Ohio State locker room, I think if he was getting advice and it was good, bad, and different, I think the Ohio State players probably would have looked on that and like, okay, I understand where he's coming from. He's going to be out for the year. They're telling him he's got to do this to rehab. He's trying to be ready for the combine and pro day. Like, I think they probably would have given Josh Simmons the benefit of the doubt after everything they had been through with him, which is, really what happened with Nick Bosa. It's like, they, at that point, there was nothing more that he can contribute, and everyone's choice is going to be different. And I think
Nick stuck around for like a month before he left, at least. Josh was like, he had the Oregon game, he gets hurt, and then there's an off week, and then he's gone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it was like the moment that, and maybe I'm remembering it incorrectly. Like Nick waited, and then once it became clear that he had to have that surgery, it was like, all right, well, now I've got to go somewhere else and do this. But I don't remember, right? I don't think he had it immediately. He got re-injured in the TCU game, and then it was like, could he come back? When is he coming back? Oh no, he's gone forever. Like, that's it. Anyway, it's neither here nor there, and that's just there is some Josh Simmons conversation, or Jimmy Simmons, as he is still widely referred to for reasons that are unfair, I think, to him.
I want to be clear. I'm not like suggesting people should be upset at Josh about it. I'm just curious about it from a personal perspective and a human side of it. Like, how does that feel when a guy that you've gone through the rigor with and gone through the mud with, and then he's gone, and then he shows up, he's at the Rose Bowl, but then it's like, yeah, that's funny. Like, I don't know, because he's in California, so the Rose Bowl's fine, but it's weird. I just really hate the professionalization of college football, to be honest.
I know you do.
The more you see it, the more you're like, man, that is unfortunate, because these guys have such a unique opportunity to share a bond for the rest of their lives. And I don't know, like the opportunity to go get ready for the NFL draft with your agent in California sounds cool for 2 months, but also like the opportunity to be a part of something that you helped build and win a championship seems like it would be more valuable 50 years from now when someone's looking back on their life and going, man, I wish I would have been there.
Yeah,
like John Anderson said.
I agree. I think a lot of people do, especially when it comes to the professionalization part there. But plenty more conversation on that Ohio State offensive line.
One more thing. This is it. We're replacing the podcast daily on Friday with the Justin Fry 24 Ever interview. But that means we don't get to say happy birthday to Austin J. Ward on the podcast daily. His birthday is Friday, everyone. So make sure that you attack him on social media. And I mean that whatever way you want. You can attack him with social media happy birthday wishes, or you can tell him to F right off. Either way, Austin's going to be fine with it.
You did that already.
Yeah, I did. So just make sure that you're blowing up his phone on Friday so that he can't put it down.
Great.
So happy 42nd birthday to you on the eve of your birth.
Thank you. That's right. It is Thursday. Today is Thursday. It is a Three Things Thursday. And the Justin Fry 24 Ever is coming your way on Friday on the podcast daily. We hope you enjoy it. Seems like the first couple episodes have been well received by you all. We're going to keep doing our best to tell as many of those stories as we possibly can. And every Thursday, we're going to talk about three things on the podcast daily. For Berm, I am Austin. We'll talk to y'all later.